It happened on a warm afternoon, the kind that makes the air feel heavy and slow. People were moving lazily through the streets, and even the sun seemed tired as it hung overhead. The woman driving down the quiet road wasn't in a rush. She had finished a long day of meetings and was on her way home, hoping to enjoy a peaceful evening. She kept her windows slightly open to let the warm breeze in, and soft music played in the background, easing the last bit of tension from her shoulders. She didn't notice the police car until the lights flashed behind her. At first, she was confused. She checked her speed, checked the road around her, and then sighed and pulled over to the side. She wasn't upset, just curious about why she had been stopped. She turned off the music and waited calmly. A few seconds later, the officer stepped out of his car. He walked toward her with fast, sharp steps, the kind of walk that said he was already annoyed before the conversation even began. She could sense it in his posture, in the way his hand rested on his belt, and how he didn't look at her fully when he reached the window. "License and registration," he said in a firm, impatient voice. She gave him a polite smile. "Of course, officer. May I ask why I was stopped?" He let out a short breath, almost a scoff. "Just give me the documents first." She nodded gently and handed them over. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She kept a calm expression, letting the moment pass without letting it bother her. Over the years, she had learned that staying composed was often the best way to protect her peace. The officer snatched the documents a little too quickly, as if he was in a hurry or simply irritated. Then he looked at her again, this time with a bit more scrutiny, as though he was trying to figure her out. She met his gaze without fear, but without challenge either. Her calmness almost seemed to irritate him more. "You know why I pulled you over?" he asked. "No, officer," she answered softly. "You didn't come to a complete stop at that last sign back there." She paused. She remembered the stop sign clearly. She had stopped fully, waited, looked around, and moved on. But she also knew that arguing would not help. Sometimes people saw things differently, especially when they were tired or stressed. "I understand," she said. "If that's how it appeared, I'm sorry." The officer narrowed his eyes slightly. It was as if he had expected her to argue, expected her to push back. When she didn't, he seemed almost thrown off balance. Still, the impatience stayed in his voice. "You need to be more careful," he said sharply. "You can't just roll through signs because you feel like it." She nodded again, though she knew she hadn't rolled through anything. "I'll be more careful," she replied. He shook his head, muttering something under his breath that she couldn't fully hear. It wasn't friendly. He walked back to his car, leaving her waiting in the stillness of the warm afternoon. She watched him in the mirror, seeing how tense his shoulders were as he typed something into his computer. While she waited, she kept her eyes on the trees swaying lightly outside her window. She didn't want to absorb the negativity the officer was carrying. She had spent her day in a courtroom resolving conflicts, listening to tense voices, and balancing difficult decisions. She didn't want this moment to follow the same pattern. After several minutes, the officer returned. His tone had not softened. "I'm giving you a warning today," he said, handing back her documents. "But make sure you actually pay attention next time." She accepted the papers calmly. "Thank you, officer." He gave her one last look, a look filled with irritation he never explained. Then he turned and walked back to his car. She waited until he drove off before she took a slow breath. She wasn't angry. She wasn't shaken. She had seen these moments before, moments where someone's stress spills over onto others without reason. When she finally drove away, she did so gently, letting the tension fade as much as possible. She didn't tell anyone about the incident. To her, it wasn't worth turning into a story. It was just an uncomfortable moment in a long day. She had more important things to focus on. She reached home, made a cup of tea, and sat quietly on her balcony. She allowed the breeze to wash away the last traces of frustration in the air. She believed in balance, in staying centered, and in giving people the benefit of the doubt, even when they didn't behave their best. What she didn't know was that the officer would remember this moment far more than she did. He would remember it the next morning, and the next. He would replay it, wondering why he acted the way he did, wondering why her calm expression bothered him, wondering why he had let his long day push him into unkindness. She had no idea that their paths were about to cross again. She didn't know that the officer would soon be standing in a courtroom, staring up at her, realizing he had spoken to someone with far more strength and dignity than he ever guessed. For now, she simply enjoyed her tea, unaware that life was preparing to bring the moment full circle in a way neither of them could forget. The next morning started early for her. She woke before sunrise, as she often did, because the quiet hours of early morning helped her think clearly. She prepared her notes, reviewed upcoming cases, and got ready for another full day in court. It was routine for her. She liked routine. It kept her grounded. As she drove toward the courthouse, she passed the same street where the officer had stopped her. She didn't give it a second thought. To her, it was already in the past. Meanwhile, the officer was starting his shift with a weight on his mind. He didn't tell anyone about the traffic stop, but he couldn't stop thinking about it. He kept remembering the calm way she spoke, the quiet respect in her voice. It made him uncomfortable, not because she did anything wrong, but because he realized he had let his impatience speak louder than his duty. And now he was carrying the guilt of it. When he received the schedule for the day and saw that he had to appear in court for a routine matter, he didn't think much of it. He simply gathered his notes and drove to the courthouse, unaware of the surprise waiting for him. She walked into the courtroom with her usual calm presence. People greeted her with quiet respect. Staff, attorneys, even nervous individuals waiting for their cases. Her reputation wasn't loud or dramatic. It was built on years of fair decisions, kind explanations, and a steady voice that never tried to intimidate. She took her seat, settled her papers, and prepared for the first case. At the same time, the officer walked through the courthouse doors, straightening his uniform and taking a deep breath. He wasn't nervous. He just wanted the day to go smoothly. He stepped into the courtroom and stopped. There she was, sitting at the front. Wearing the robe of a judge, the woman he had spoken to so sharply the day before. For a moment, everything inside him froze. He felt heat rising in his face, a heavy knot forming in his stomach. He had no idea what to do. Should he say something? Should he apologize? Should he pretend nothing happened? She looked up briefly as he entered the room, and though her expression remained neutral, he felt the weight of recognition. But she did not frown. She did not glare. She gave no sign of anger. She simply acknowledged him with the same calm, steady presence she always carried, and that scared him more than anything else had. He took a seat quietly, hoping no one noticed the way his hands trembled slightly. He tried to focus on his papers, but his mind was spinning. How was this going to go? Would she call him out in front of everyone? Would she file a complaint? Would this become something bigger than he could handle? He didn't know. All he knew was that he had spoken to her as if she didn't matter. And now she was the one person in the room with the authority to judge him, not as revenge, but simply by the nature of her role. She opened the session with her usual clear tone, addressing the courtroom with calm confidence. Her voice carried strength, not from volume, but from the sincerity behind it. As the cases began, the officer sat silently, waiting for the moment when he would have to stand before her, waiting for whatever she might say, waiting, in truth, for the lesson he didn't yet know he was about to receive. And in that moment, He realized something he had never fully understood before. Respect is not about who holds power. It is about who chooses to carry it with grace. The officer sat quietly in the courtroom, trying to steady his breathing, though nothing seemed to help. He had been in court many times before. He knew the routine. He knew how to speak, how to stand, how to present reports. But today felt different. Today he was not just an officer doing his job. Today he was a man who had acted poorly, sitting in front of someone who had every right to confront him. He kept replaying the moment from the day before. The way he spoke, the tone he used, the rush of irritation he had felt. It all felt foolish now. Instead of acting like a professional, he had let a long shift, a bit of stress, and a moment of frustration turn him into someone he didn't even like. He wondered how many times he had done that without noticing. How many people walked away from him feeling disrespected. He didn't want to think about it, but the thoughts kept pushing into his mind. Meanwhile, she sat at the front of the courtroom, reviewing documents with a calm expression that never broke. She had a way of carrying herself that made the entire room feel settled. People who entered nervous often found themselves relaxing without realizing why. It was her presence, quiet but steady, gentle but firm. She knew the officer had recognized her. She had seen the shock in his eyes when he walked in. She had seen him almost freeze mid-step, as though he had stepped into a moment he didn't know how to handle. She didn't hold anger toward him. She didn't see a reason to embarrass him. Life had taught her that people often act out of stress, not bad intentions. But she also believed in accountability, in lessons taught not through punishment, but through reflection. The session continued smoothly. Case after case passed, each one requiring her attention, her judgment, her sense of fairness. She listened carefully to each side, asked questions gently, and explained her rulings in simple, clear words. Her approach made even complicated matters feel understandable. People appreciated that, but the officer barely heard any of it. His focus kept drifting. His hands felt too warm, his throat too dry, his collar too tight. He had never felt this uncomfortable in court before. Usually, he walked in feeling confident, prepared, and composed. Today, he felt like a student called to the front of the class without knowing the answer. Finally, after what felt like hours, the clerk called the next matter. It involved the officer's report. The officer swallowed and stood slowly. He walked to the front of the room, each step feeling heavier than the last. When he reached the stand, he adjusted his uniform slightly, trying to keep his hands from shaking. She looked at him with a calm expression. No anger, no disappointment, no reaction at all. If she recognized him, she didn't show it. But the officer knew she did. He could feel it. She began the hearing the same way she always did, with a tone that was steady and respectful. "Officer, please summarize the events as they appear in your report." Her voice wasn't sharp. It wasn't cold. It was simply professional, exactly what she had shown the day before. Even as he spoke sharply to her, he nodded, though his throat felt dry. "Yes, Your Honor." He began reading from his notes, explaining the incident that had brought him to court that day. But as he spoke, he felt distracted. He felt constantly aware of who he was talking to. He struggled to keep his thoughts straight. He stumbled over one or two lines, something he rarely did. She listened without interrupting, giving him her full attention. Her eyes stayed steady on him, not judging, just observing. It made him feel seen in a way that was both uncomfortable and strangely grounding. When he finished, she nodded lightly. "Thank you, officer." He stepped back slightly, unsure if he was supposed to sit or keep standing. His mind felt too full to process anything. She looked down at her papers, reviewing them briefly. Then she lifted her eyes again, meeting his with a calm, even gaze. "Officer," she said softly, "I want to discuss something with you." not related to the report. His heart stopped. He felt the room shrink around him. The air suddenly felt heavier. He could hear a faint buzzing in his ears. "Yes, Your Honor," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't allow the moment to become dramatic or tense. She simply spoke with the same tone she used for everything: clear, controlled, steady. "Yesterday, you conducted a traffic stop," she said. The officer closed his eyes briefly. He already knew where she was going. She continued, "I was the driver." A whisper rippled through a few people in the courtroom, just soft enough to be heard. The officer felt his stomach twist. He wanted to shrink, to disappear, to undo the moment entirely. He had never felt this embarrassed in his life. "I see," he managed to say quietly. "Your Honor, I didn't realize." She raised a hand gently, stopping him before he could continue. "I understand. You didn't know who I was, and you treated me the way you felt was appropriate at the time." Her voice held no anger, no sarcasm, no bitterness. That almost made it worse. He lowered his eyes, unable to look at her anymore. "I want to speak to you," she continued, not as a judge addressing an officer, but as one person speaking to another. The entire courtroom fell silent. Even the air seemed to still. She leaned forward slightly, her hands resting on the desk before her. "One of the responsibilities we share," she said, "is to remain calm and respectful, even when we are tired or pressured." He nodded slowly, gripping the edge of the stand to steady himself. Her words felt like they were landing directly on his chest. "We meet people on their worst days," she continued. "We witness frustration, fear, conflict, and stress. Many of the people we encounter are already overwhelmed before we speak to them." He kept his eyes down, ashamed, knowing exactly what she was referring to without her having to say it. "When we let our own frustration control our behavior," she said softly, "we add to their burden instead of easing it." Her voice was gentle, not scolding, not harsh, just honest. The officer swallowed, his throat tight. "Your Honor," he said slowly, "I was disrespectful, and I'm sorry." She nodded once, accepting his apology without making a show of it. "Thank you," she replied. "But my point is not to shame you." He looked up, surprised. She continued, "My point is that every interaction we have matters, more than we sometimes realize. The way we speak to people, the tone we use, the patience we show or don't show can stay with someone long after the moment is over." The officer felt his breath shake. Her words weren't just about him. They were about his entire approach to his job, his attitude, his mindset. He felt something shift inside him, a realization he hadn't faced before. "You did your job yesterday," she said calmly, "but the way you carried yourself is something I hope you reflect on." Her eyes were gentle, not accusing. "Because you have the power to make someone's day harder or easier." He nodded again, this time with more sincerity. "I understand," he said quietly, "and I'll do better." "I believe you will," she replied. And there was something in her voice, something warm, something trusting, that made him want to prove her right. The room remained silent. No one laughed, no one whispered, no one looked away. Everyone seemed caught in the moment, watching a lesson unfold that was deeper than procedure or protocol. Then she gently moved the session forward, returning to the court matter without dragging out the moment. She didn't mention it again. She didn't make him feel small. She simply continued the hearing as if nothing unusual had occurred. But everything had changed for him. When the hearing ended, the officer stepped back slowly. He felt lighter and heavier, at the same time lighter because she had shown him grace, and heavier because he understood the weight of what he needed to change. People began leaving the courtroom. Papers shuffled, chairs moved, conversations started. But the officer remained still for several seconds, processing everything. He felt humbled, challenged, shaken, and strangely grateful. He walked out of the courtroom quietly, without rushing, without letting his thoughts scatter. He needed time to reflect. He needed time to understand why the moment affected him so deeply. Outside the courthouse, the sunlight felt different, brighter, warmer, clearer. He took a deep breath, feeling the air fill his lungs in a way that grounded him. He had walked into the courtroom expecting a routine day. Instead, he had walked into a lesson he didn't know he needed. A lesson that would stay with him far longer than any warning, any lecture, or any punishment. And as he walked toward his car, he realized something he hadn't understood before. Respect isn't something you give based on who someone is. It's something you give because of who you choose to be. The rest of the day moved forward, but for the officer, nothing felt the same. Every conversation he had, every call he responded to, every small moment of interaction felt different now. It was as if someone had quietly placed a mirror in front of him, and he could no longer ignore their reflection. He kept hearing her voice in his mind, not the words themselves, but the calm tone she used, the steady way she spoke, the gentleness that carried more weight than anger ever could. It followed him long after he left the courtroom. When he returned to the station, some of his coworkers greeted him with jokes and small talk, but he wasn't really listening. He nodded, answered politely, and went on with his paperwork. But the truth was, he wasn't present. Not fully. His thoughts kept drifting back to the woman in the robe. Sitting with so much quiet strength, it made him rethink everything he believed about authority and respect. Later that evening, after filing his reports, he sat alone in the break room. The lights were dimmer at this hour, and the station was quieter. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes for a moment. He felt drained, not physically, but emotionally. The kind of exhaustion that comes from finally confronting something inside yourself. He thought back to the moment he pulled her over. He remembered how impatient he felt when he stepped out of his car. He remembered the irritation in his voice, the dismissive tone, the way he took her documents without looking at her properly. Back then, it felt normal. It felt like a routine stop. But now, looking at it through the lens of what happened in court, he realized how careless he had been with his own attitude. He wondered how she remained so calm. Many people would have argued back. Many would have raised their voice or shown frustration. But she didn't. She stayed steady, polite, patient. Thinking about it now, he understood why that bothered him so much at the time. Her calmness forced him to see his own behavior more clearly. As he sat quietly, he thought about something else too, something she had said. Every interaction we have matters. He had heard words like that before. In training sessions, in workshops, in posters about community relations. But they never landed the way they did when she said them. Maybe it was her tone, or the timing, or the fact that she had every reason to embarrass him, but chose instead to offer wisdom. Whatever it was, he knew the moment had changed him. He didn't know how yet, but something inside him had shifted. When his shift ended, he stepped outside into the cool night air. The sky was dark, but the city lights brightened the sidewalks. He walked to his car slowly, replaying everything again and again. He wasn't trying to punish himself. He was trying to understand. He drove home quietly, without music, letting the silence help his thoughts settle. When he reached his house, he didn't turn on the TV or scroll through his phone like he usually did. Instead, he sat at his kitchen table with a glass of water, staring at the simple, soft glow of the lamp above him. He felt small. Not in a bad way. Not in a weak way. In a humbled way. He felt like he had been walking through his job with blinders on, focusing only on rules and procedures, forgetting the human part of the work. But the judge, she hadn't forgotten the human part. It was her whole presence. her whole way of speaking, her entire approach. That night, he barely slept. He kept waking up, thinking about the moment she said, "I believe you will." Those words carried more weight than he expected. Someone believing in him, even after witnessing his worst, felt like a responsibility. He didn't want to fail Dot by morning. He made a silent promise to himself. He would be better, not just in how he spoke, but in how he treated people, how he carried himself, how he used the authority given to him. He didn't want another moment like the one he had with her. He didn't want to feel that kind of regret again. The next day, the judge began her morning the same way she always did. She woke early, prepared her notes, and brewed a small cup of tea. Her home was peaceful, with sunlight touching the edges of every surface. She liked mornings. They gave her space to prepare her mind for the heavy decisions she had to make. Throughout the day, she thought briefly about the officer from the courtroom. She didn't hold negativity toward him. She understood that people often carried stress that spilled into their behavior. But she also believed deeply in teaching through example, and she hoped the moment would help him, not hurt him. She didn't dwell on it. She had a full day ahead, and she needed her focus. But there was a small, quiet hope inside her that he would take the experience to heart. Not because she wanted anything from him, but because she believed everyone deserved interactions, rooted in respect, something she tried to model each day. When she arrived at the courthouse, the staff greeted her warmly. She walked through the hallways, offering gentle smiles and short greetings. Her presence always brought a sense of calm. People respected her, but it wasn't fear-based. It was admiration earned by her fairness, her patience, and her ability to listen without judgment. Meanwhile, the officer started his day with a different energy. When he put on his uniform, he felt the weight of it more clearly. He realized it wasn't just fabric and metal, it was responsibility. Responsibility to be steady, to be patient, to be fair. As he drove through the city, he noticed things he had overlooked before. A tired expression on a shop owner sweeping the sidewalk. A teenager walking to school with a heavy backpack. A mother holding her child's hand at a crosswalk. These were small things, simple moments, but they reminded him that everyone carried something unseen. When he responded to calls that morning, he spoke more gently. He paused before reacting. He listened more carefully. He wasn't perfect, not yet, but he was trying. And for the first time in a long time, trying felt meaningful. Later that afternoon, an unexpected call came through the radio about a minor traffic dispute. When he arrived at the scene, two drivers were arguing loudly, each blaming the other. Normally, he would have stepped in quickly, using a firm voice to regain control. But today, he approached differently. He spoke softly, asked each person to breathe, and took the time to listen. Within a few minutes, the tension eased. The drivers calmed down. The moment resolved without raised voices or anger. He felt something settle inside him, a confirmation that he was heading in the right direction. But his thoughts drifted back to the judge again. He wondered if she had any idea how much her words affected him. He wondered if she knew the impact she made, just by choosing patience over anger. He didn't expect their paths to cross again anytime soon. Their first two encounters had been so unexpected that a third seemed unlikely. But life had a way of bringing certain people back into our path, especially when a lesson wasn't finished yet. And though the officer didn't know it, their story wasn't done. Not even close. A few days later, the judge prepared for a community meeting she attended once a month. It was an event held at a small local center where officials, officers, residents, and volunteers gathered to discuss issues, share experiences, and strengthen trust between the community and the justice system. She always made sure to attend when her schedule allowed, because she believed deeply in connecting with people outside the courtroom. That same morning, The officer's supervisor asked him to represent the department at the very same meeting. It was a routine assignment, something officers rotated through. He agreed without thinking much of it. He didn't look at the list of attendees. He didn't know who would be there. He simply prepared himself the best he could, hoping to show the kind of patience and respect he had been practicing. The meeting took place in a modest hall with rows of chairs arranged neatly. People filtered in, greeting one another, finding seats. The air buzzed with soft conversation. The officer arrived early, choosing a seat near the front. He sat with his hands resting on his knees, breathing slowly, trying to stay centered. A few minutes later, the room grew quieter. People turned slightly, acknowledging someone entering the hall. He looked up. There she was, walking calmly toward the front. The judge. He felt the breath leave his body for a moment. Of all the people who could have attended, he hadn't expected her. He watched as she greeted a few community members with her warm smile and took a seat near the front of the room. He felt a mix of nerves and gratitude. He didn't know if she would speak today. He didn't know if they would interact. But he felt something inside him shift again, another chance. Another step in a journey he didn't realize he was on till she became part of it. When the meeting began, the moderator invited people to share thoughts about challenges in the community and ideas for improving trust. Several people spoke, some about safety, some about youth programs, some about communication between officers and residents. Then the judge stood up. The room quieted. She began to speak not as a judge, not as an authority figure, but as a human being. She spoke about compassion, about listening, about meeting people with patience, even when it's hard. She spoke about the importance of dignity, both in giving and receiving it. Her words felt familiar to the officer, echoes of what she had said in the courtroom. But hearing them in a room full of people, spoken with warmth and conviction, made them even more powerful. He listened closely, absorbing every word. He felt grateful, not for being corrected, but for being taught, for being guided without being shamed, for being given a chance to grow. And though she didn't mention him. The morning of the hearing arrived with a calm sky. Yet inside the courtroom building, there was a quiet tension that seemed to sit in the air like a thin fog. People moved in and out of the halls with folders tucked under their arms, some whispering to one another, others sitting quietly on benches, waiting for their names to be called. It looked like any other morning, but for the officer who stepped through the doors, it felt far from ordinary. He had barely slept the night before. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the face of the woman he had spoken to so sharply at the traffic stop. He remembered the impatience in his own voice, the dismissive tone, the way he had talked over her without thinking. Now the memory felt heavier than ever as he walked into the same building she worked in every day. He tried to steady himself, breathing in slowly as he made his way toward the courtroom. The hallway lights felt too bright, and every step echoed louder than it needed to. He told himself that maybe she wouldn't be the judge on his case. Maybe she worked in another department. Maybe she was on a break. Maybe anything. Anything except standing before her again with the roles reversed. But deep down, he already knew the truth. When he opened the door to the courtroom, he saw her immediately. She was on the bench, robe neatly pressed, posture calm and steady, eyes scanning through paperwork with quiet focus. She didn't even look up as he entered. She seemed completely unaware of his presence, or maybe she was simply choosing not to acknowledge it yet. Either way, seeing her there only made his stomach twist tighter. He took a seat at the side of the room, trying not to draw attention to himself. A few people whispered among themselves as others waited for their names to be called. The judge continued working like everything was completely normal. Watching her sit there with such calm authority made him feel even smaller. He wondered how she could look so composed after the way he had treated her. It wasn't that he expected anger. He had just expected something. A glance, a frown, a sign that she remembered him. But she remained focused, collected, steady. As the cases began, the courtroom moved like a quiet current. One person after another walked up to speak, some nervous, others frustrated, and a few simply grateful to have a chance to explain themselves. Through it all, the judge remained patient and fair, never raising her voice, never showing judgment on her face. The officer watched her with a new kind of respect. He had never seen her work before, and now he couldn't look away. She was different from what he expected, different from what he had assumed when he first saw her on the side of the road. And every minute he watched her, the weight of his own actions grew heavier. By the time his case was called, his legs felt stiff. He stood slowly, as if giving himself time to gather strength he wasn't sure he had left. As he walked toward the front, his heartbeat thudded loudly in his ears. The judge looked up from her papers, and for the first time that day, their eyes met. Her expression didn't change. She didn't raise an eyebrow, or frown, or show even the smallest sign of annoyance. She simply looked at him with calm attention. "Please step forward," she said. Her voice was steady and clear, the same voice she had used with everyone else who had stood before her. It surprised him more than it should have. He took a few more steps and stopped at the front. The room felt too quiet suddenly, as if everyone sensed something different in the air. A few heads turned slightly, curious. The judge glanced down at her notes. "State your name for the record." He did. His voice felt dry. She nodded once and continued reading through the file. He waited, unsure if she was going to mention the traffic stop right away or pretend it never happened. His hands were cold even though the room was warm. And she lifted her eyes again. "Before we begin, I need you to describe the events that brought you here today." He swallowed. His throat tightened as he began explaining the incident, not the traffic stop, but the case he was officially present for. He tried to speak clearly, but his words felt tangled. He kept stumbling over small details, forgetting parts he had practiced in his head earlier. The judge didn't interrupt him. She didn't correct him or rush him. She listened, giving him the same respect she gave everyone else. Her expression remained thoughtful and steady, but somehow that made him feel even more uneasy. He tried to explain everything as best as he could, though he knew he was doing a poor job. The room felt like it was closing in on him, not because of her, but because of himself. He felt the weight of his behavior more now than at any moment before. After what felt like a long time, he finally finished speaking. His voice fell silent, and so did the room. He waited for her to respond, unable to tear his eyes away from her face. The judge folded her hands gently and took a breath. "Thank you," she said. "Now, before we move forward, there is something we need to address." The officer's stomach dropped. The room seemed to lean forward slightly, sensing a shift. "Yesterday," the judge began, her tone still steady, "I had an interaction that I feel is important to discuss here today." She didn't look harsh or angry. There was no sharpness in her voice. If anything, her expression seemed thoughtful, almost reflective. "During a routine traffic stop," she continued, "I was spoken to in a manner that did not match the standards of the role of an officer." The officer's face heated. He could feel every pair of eyes in the room turning toward him. His chest tightened, but the judge's voice remained calm. "I want to be clear," she said. "I am not bringing this up to embarrass anyone. I am mentioning it because moments like that show us how quickly assumptions can form when we're frustrated or stressed." There was a soft murmur from the seats behind him, but the judge's gaze didn't leave his. It wasn't a harsh look, but it held a kind of quiet truth that made him feel even smaller. "When you are in uniform," she said gently, "the way you speak carries more weight than you may realize." People look to you as someone who can help, guide, or calm a situation. Your tone can change the direction of someone's day without you even knowing it. Her words were not meant to wound him. They carried no bitterness. They felt more like a reminder than a punishment. But somehow, that made them even more impactful. Yesterday, she added softly, you spoke to me with impatience. But even if I had been anyone at all, that tone would have felt the same. The officer wanted to speak, wanted to explain, wanted to apologize, but he wasn't sure if it was his place to interrupt. His breath shook slightly as he stood there. The judge paused, letting the room settle. We all have days where we act less kindly than we intend to, she said. We're human. But being human also means we can learn from those moments. The courtroom was silent. Even the air seemed to soften. The officer felt something shift inside him. Not fear, not shame, but recognition. She wasn't attacking him. She was offering him a chance to grow without tearing him down. The judge closed the file gently. Let's proceed, she said, but the officer's mind remained on her words long after she moved on to the next part of the case. He knew this moment would stay with him for a long time. He had expected anger, judgment, or punishment. Instead, she had given him something he didn't expect at all, a lesson wrapped in dignity, and that made it hit even harder. The officer walked out of the courtroom that day with a strange heaviness in his chest, but it wasn't the kind that pulled him down. It was the kind that made a person stop, think, and look at their own reflection with honest eyes. The hallway outside the courtroom felt wider than usual, as if the space itself held a quiet message. People passed him, talking about their cases, their families, their errands for the day, but he barely heard any of it. His thoughts were still inside that courtroom, replaying the judge's calm words. He had expected her to be upset. He had expected her to use her position to show him how wrong he was. But she didn't. Instead, she showed him something unexpected, something he couldn't ignore. Her tone had been steady, almost gentle, and yet every word she spoke felt like a mirror she placed in front of him. A mirror he couldn't look away from. He walked down the long corridor slowly, his mind drifting back to the moment she mentioned the traffic stop. She didn't shame him, didn't call him out, didn't raise her voice. She simply spoke about respect, about how a uniform carries weight, about how one person's tone can change someone's entire day. And somehow, the softness in her voice hit harder than anger ever could. He stepped outside into the fresh air and took a deep breath. The sun was warm, but he still felt small inside. Not small, in a defeated way small, in a way that made him want to grow. He wasn't a bad person. He knew that. He cared about his job. He cared about helping people. But somewhere along the line, he had allowed stress and fatigue to shape the way he spoke. He had forgotten that every person he met was dealing with something. 2. The judge reminded him. He walked toward the parking lot, his steps slow, his mind overflowing with thoughts he hadn't expected to face today. He remembered the look on her face during the traffic stop, calm, patient, even when he wasn't. She didn't snap back, didn't argue, didn't match his tone. She simply let him speak, even though he hadn't given her the same courtesy. It would have been easy for her to be defensive, but she wasn't. No. Seeing who she was in the courtroom, he understood why. She was someone who lived with purpose. Someone who didn't let frustration steer her behavior. Someone who understood the value of grace. The officer sat down in his patrol car and rested his hands on the steering wheel. The silence inside the vehicle felt heavier than the air outside. He rubbed his face, trying to clear his thoughts, but the judge's words continued echoing in his mind. We all have days where we act less kindly than we intend to. We're human. But being human also means we can learn from those moments. He had never heard those words spoken like that before, not as a lecture, but as a reminder. He wondered how many people he had spoken to harshly on days when he was tired, frustrated, or overwhelmed. How many moments had he let slip into impatience because he wasn't paying attention to his tone? How many people had walked away from an encounter with him feeling smaller because of a few careless words? He sighed deeply and leaned back in the seat, staring through the windshield at nothing in particular. He didn't want to be that kind of officer. He didn't want to be someone who added more negativity to someone else's day. He had joined the force to help people, not to intimidate or frustrate them. Somewhere along the way, he had forgotten parts of that goal. The judge helped him remember Dot as he sat there. He made a quiet promise to himself. He would do better. He would slow down, breathe before speaking, and remind himself that the person standing in front of him was human too, just like him. He couldn't change the mistakes he had already made, but he could change what he did moving forward. He stayed in the car for several minutes before finally turning the key and starting the engine. The drive back to the station felt different today. He wasn't listening to the radio like he usually did. He wasn't thinking about what he was going to eat for lunch or what he had planned after his shift. His mind stayed on the judge, her quiet strength, her patience, her message. By the time he arrived at the station, he felt more settled, but still reflective. A few coworkers greeted him as he walked in. He nodded back, but he wasn't in the mood for small talk. He went to his locker, sat down on the bench, and just breathed for a moment. He thought about how easy it is for people to judge others without knowing anything about them. He had done it yesterday, assuming the woman he pulled over was just another driver who wasn't paying attention. He hadn't stopped to consider that she might have been tired, stressed, or dealing with something personal. He didn't know she was a judge, and even if she hadn't been, she still deserved respect. He remembered how annoyed he felt when she tried to explain something during the stop and how he cut her off before she finished speaking. He winced at the memory. He knew better than that. He had been trained to listen, to stay calm, to show respect no matter what. But somehow, the job had worn him down, and he had let that frustration bleed into his behavior. He didn't want to be someone who forgot why he started. After a few minutes, he stood up and took a slow breath. He knew there was one thing he needed to do before his shift ended. He needed to apologize, not because he was forced to, not because someone had told him to, but because he wanted to. He didn't know if she would accept the apology, or even if he would get the chance to speak with her. But he felt it was the right thing to do. So after finishing his paperwork and making sure his duties were complete, he headed back toward the courthouse. It felt strange to walk through the same doors again on the same day, but this time, his steps felt lighter, even though the moment ahead carried weight. He approached the courtroom quietly, unsure if the session was still going. When he peeked inside, he saw that it was empty. The judge was still seated at her bench, organizing papers. The room was quiet, filled only with the soft sound of pages being turned. He stepped in slowly. She looked up, recognizing him instantly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence didn't feel tense. It felt honest. The officer took a breath. "I wanted to say something before I leave," he said quietly. Her expression was calm, open. "I was wrong yesterday," he said, voice steady but sincere. "I spoke to you in a way I shouldn't have. I let stress control my tone, and that's not an excuse. You deserved respect, just like anyone else. I'm sorry." The judge studied him for a brief moment, not judging him, just seeing him. "Thank you for saying that," she replied gently. "It takes honesty to reflect on your actions." "I appreciate it." He nodded, relieved, but still humbled. She continued, "We all learn. What matters is what you do after the mistake." Her words washed over him with the same quiet strength she had shown in the courtroom. He felt grateful, not just for her understanding, but for the lesson she unknowingly gave him. "I'll do better," he said softly. "I believe you," she replied. He nodded again, then slowly stepped back and exited the courtroom. The hallway felt lighter this time, not because the moment was easy, but because he had faced it. Outside, the sun was lower in the sky, casting warm light across the steps. The officer stood there for a moment, breathing in the cool air. He didn't feel defeated. He felt changed. He knew he couldn't fix everything overnight, but he could start with himself. He could start with the way he spoke, the way he listened, the way he carried himself. The judge's reaction hadn't just surprised him, it had opened his eyes. And now, he wanted to live in a way that honored that lesson. He walked toward his car with a new sense of clarity. Every day on the job would bring new challenges, new people, new situations. But now, he would face them with a different mindset. Her grace had become his turning point, and he would never forget it. The sun was not fully risen yet, but the sky had begun to glow with soft colors, warm pinks, faded gold, and a slow stretch of light that gently touched the tops of buildings in the city. It felt like a peaceful morning, the kind that carried a quiet promise in the air. And somewhere in that same city, the officer sat in his car for a long moment before finally taking a deep breath and stepping out. Today felt different. Not because of the work ahead or the calls he expected to handle, but because of everything he carried with him inside. The judge's words had stayed with him overnight, replaying in small waves every time he closed his eyes. It wasn't guilt that kept him awake, it was reflection. Honest reflection. Something he hadn't given himself in a long time. He walked toward the station with a new sense of awareness. The building looked the same. The morning chatter among officers sounded the same. The hallway smelled faintly of coffee, yet something inside him had shifted. A few people greeted him as he passed, and he greeted them back, not just with a nod, but with a little more warmth than usual. He wasn't trying to be someone new. He was simply trying to be more present, not more thoughtful, more aware. By the time he reached his desk, he had made a silent promise again, this time not only to himself, but to the job he once loved with clear intention. He would not forget the responsibility that came with wearing the uniform. He would not forget the weight his tone carried. And he would not forget the judge, who reminded him of all the things he had been slowly losing sight of. Later that morning, he was assigned a call involving a small dispute between two neighbors. Normally, he might approach situations like that with impatience, knowing it was minor and often rooted in misunderstandings. But today, he reminded himself to breathe before speaking, to listen first, to see the people behind the complaint. When he arrived, the two neighbors were frustrated, talking over each other, pointing fingers, each convinced they were the one being wronged. The officer took a slow breath and lifted a hand gently, not to silence them, but to get their attention. "Let me hear each of you," he said calmly, "one at a time. I'm here to help, not take sides." His tone was steady, even kind. And something unexpected happened. They listened. They actually paused and let him guide the conversation. Within minutes, the tension lowered. People who had come close to shouting earlier were now speaking in calmer voices, explaining themselves more clearly. The officer mediating the conversation felt a sense of purpose settle inside him. Not pride purpose. He remembered what the judge had said about the weight of one person's tone. He saw it now, right in front of him. He saw how his calmness created calmness in others, how his patience shifted the direction of the interaction, how simply treating people with respect changed the whole outcome. By the time he left the scene, the two neighbors were not best friends, but they were talking instead of arguing. They thanked him, both of them. And the officer realized something important in that moment. Respect invites respect. He carried that feeling with him for the rest of the day. Later in the afternoon, He stopped by a small cafe to grab a coffee. As he waited at the counter, he looked around at the people inside, the tired workers. The students typing quickly on their laptops, the older couple sharing a quiet meal, the barista moving quickly behind the counter. Everyone had something on their mind, something unseen. Everyone carried their own stories, their own burdens. He thought again about how quickly he had judged the judge the day of the traffic stop, how easily he had let his frustration shape the way he spoke, and how powerful her response had been, not defensive, not angry, but controlled and gracious. His thoughts returned to her more than once throughout the day, not because she was someone important in the public eye, but because she became important in his own personal shift. As the day drew to a close, he felt a pull toward the courthouse again, though this time not for duty or apology, but for something he couldn't quite name. Maybe closure, maybe curiosity, maybe gratitude. When he reached the steps of the courthouse, it was late afternoon. The building glowed softly in the fading sunlight, the tall windows catching the golden light. He stood there for a moment, unsure whether to go inside. He didn't need anything. He didn't have a message to deliver. But still, he felt drawn to step closer. Inside, the hallways were quieter than they had been the day before. A few workers were packing up for the evening, gathering files, setting down pens, closing doors behind them. As he walked past them, he felt a small flutter of nervousness. He wondered if he even should be here, but something nudged him forward, an instinct, perhaps, or simply a desire to understand what had happened inside him since that courtroom moment. He approached the courtroom doors slowly and peered inside. The judge was there again, though not on the bench this time. She was at her desk, reading through paperwork. Her robe hung neatly on the chair beside her. He lifted a hand gently and tapped on the doorframe. She looked up. There was a pause, a moment where they simply acknowledged each other's presence without words. The silence felt comfortable. Open, honest. She spoke first. Back again? She asked softly, not with sarcasm, but with a gentle curiosity. He nodded. If it's all right, he began. She gave a small nod. Of course. The officer stepped inside, closing the door halfway behind him. He stood there for a moment, unsure how to begin. She waited patiently. I've been thinking a lot about what you said yesterday, he finally said. She folded her hands, listening. It wasn't just about the stop, he continued slowly. It was about everything behind it. My tone, my attitude, the way I let stress control me. I didn't realize how much I had changed over time. He paused, choosing his words with care. What you said, it didn't make me feel ashamed. It made me want to be better. The judge smiled softly, not a wide smile, but one filled with quiet understanding. That's the part people often miss, she said. Growth doesn't come from being torn down. It comes from seeing yourself clearly. Her words settled in the air between them. The officer nodded slowly. I wanted to thank you, he said, not just for being patient with me, but for showing me something I'd forgotten about myself. The judge leaned back slightly, her expression warm. You reminded yourself, she said. I just held up the mirror. Her calmness carried weight, but not the heavy kind, the grounding kind. The officer looked around the quiet courtroom. I didn't realize how much one moment can change everything, he said. It can, she replied, but only if you let it. He nodded again, feeling the truth of that statement settle inside him. After a long, peaceful silence, he said, I don't know what tomorrow brings, but I know I'll handle it differently. And that, she said with gentle conviction, is what growth looks like. The officer gave a small, respectful bow of his head and stepped back toward the door. Thank you, he said again. You're welcome, she replied. And something in her voice carried hope. When he stepped outside, The sky had shifted into deeper colors, soft purple, a touch of orange at the horizon, a calm fading of daylight. He walked slowly down the steps, breathing in the cool air. He felt lighter, not because everything was perfect or fixed, but because he had taken a step forward. He had recognized something in himself, learned from it, and made a decision to change. That alone was worth more than anything else. As he made his way back to his car, he looked back at the courthouse one last time. Not with fear, not with regret, but with gratitude. Gratitude for a moment that challenged him. A lesson that humbled him, and a judge whose quiet strength reminded him of the kind of person he wanted to be. Some lessons come with loud warnings. Some come with consequences. But the ones that change a person the most are often the quiet ones, the ones wrapped in grace. The officer carried that truth forward, knowing he would never forget the day. A calm, steady voice changed the direction of his life. And so, the story didn't end with punishment or conflict. It ended with understanding, with growth. With a second chance to do better, to speak kinder, to act with purpose. And most importantly, it ended with a reminder that respect, when given freely, has the power to transform even the heaviest moments into something meaningful. The officer walked away with a new sense of clarity, and the judge returned to her paperwork, knowing her words had not fallen on deaf ears. Both carried forward a lesson they would hold for a long time. A lesson that would ripple beyond the courtroom, quiet but powerful, just like the moment that sparked it.